The gown arrived on a hanger, not as a gift but as a sentence. Lady Winslow laid the single dress across the narrow bed in the attic room and said that this was what Eleanor Hartwell would wear for the whole of the season. Every ball, every supper, every call. Pale gray-blue muslin, turned twice already, the hem torn along one seam where a heel had caught it, and no one had troubled to mend the tear before it was handed down. Eleanor did not ask why there was only one dress when her cousins had 11 apiece. She had learned that some questions in this house cost more than they were worth. By the third ball of the season, the torn hem was no longer an accident. Cassandra Winslow trod on it deliberately at the top of the stairs, in front of 40 guests, and laughed when Eleanor caught the banister to keep from falling. The whispers followed her into the ballroom. That poor relation, always mending, never knew. She took her place near the pillars, where the shadows were kindest, and did not look up. She did not see the tall man in black at the far end of the room, who had already stopped listening to his companion in order to watch her instead. They called him the Duke of Rothmere, and they called him cold, a man who had buried a sister, and with her, whatever gentleness society believed a duke ought to display at balls. He rarely danced, he rarely spoke beyond what courtesy required. But he had watched Eleanor Hartwell straighten a hem with 2 pins and a steady hand, rather than beg to leave early, and something in his chest that had been shut for 2 years opened half an inch. He said nothing that night. It would be months, and a great deal of cruelty, before he said what he was already beginning to think. By the end of that season, in a ballroom full of the very people who had mocked her torn hem all spring, the Duke of Rothmere would cross the floor in front of everyone and call Eleanor Hartwell the loveliest woman in the room, not as flattery, but as an argument no one in that house of glass and candlelight could answer. But that night was still far away. First there would be 100 small cruelties to survive, a secret about his own sister to uncover, and a needle case that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, which was about to change everything between them. Eleanor Hartwell had lived at Winslow House since she was 14. In the year both her parents died within a season of each other, her father of a fever, and her mother, some said, of grief that followed too quickly to be anything else. She had brought 2 trunks into that house and left, within a year, with one, a small silver needle case engraved with her mother's initials, which Lady Winslow had allowed her to keep only because it was, in her aunt's words, of no value to anyone but a seamstress. Eleanor used it every night by candlelight, mending the single gown she had been given for the season, because there was no other gown, and because a torn hem, however carefully hidden, always found its way back into the light of a ballroom. Her cousins Cassandra and Delphine had wardrobes that took up an entire floor of the house, silks in rose and gold that arrived by the crate from Bond Street, and neither of them had ever threaded a needle in her life. Eleanor did not resent the gowns themselves. She resented the particular cruelty of being given exactly one, and being made to understand, at every breakfast and every fitting, that one was already more than she deserved. She kept a small mental ledger of her own, not of money but of moments, small persistent proof that she had not yet disappeared entirely into the role her aunt had assigned her, and the needle case, more than the gown itself, was where she kept the evidence. The first ball of the season was held at Camden House, and Lady Winslow made certain, before they left, that Eleanor understood the rules that would govern the coming months. She was to attend every event to which the family was invited, because refusing would draw more notice than attending in a mended dress. She was to speak when spoken to and not before. She was, above all, never to suggest to anyone that the gown she wore was the only gown she owned, though everyone in that room would know it within a fortnight regardless, because society kept better accounts of poverty than of virtue. Eleanor arrived at Camden House with the tear in her hem already stitched so finely that only someone who knew to look would find the seam, and stood at the edge of the room while her cousins were led onto the floor by eager young men who would never learn her name. She did not mind, at first, being invisible. Invisibility, she had learned, asked nothing of her and could not be taken away. What she minded was the particular attention Cassandra paid to the hem itself, finding excuses to walk near her, to tread the fabric beneath a heel as though by accident, to laugh with Delphine behind a fan when the seam gave a fraction more each time. It happened in the receiving line, in the crush before supper, when someone's elbow caught Eleanor's arm and sent her stumbling forward with the torn hem underfoot. She would have fallen against a table of Camden House's good porcelain had a hand not closed around her elbow and steadied her in a single motion, quiet enough that half the room never noticed. She looked up to thank whoever had caught her and found herself looking into the gray eyes of the Duke of Rothmere, a man she had heard described at breakfast as cold enough to freeze a room merely by entering it. He did not smile. He asked only if she was hurt, and when she said no, he released her arm and stepped back, as though the moment had cost him something to allow. It was the first time in 3 seasons that anyone in that room had touched her as though she were made of something other than an inconvenience, and she carried the thought home with her long after the carriage had turned the last corner toward Winslow House. Eleanor would spend the rest of that season trying to decide whether the gesture had meant anything at all, and failing, every time, to convince herself entirely that it had not. Cassandra saw it happen from across the room, and by the time the carriages were called that night, the story had already curdled into something uglier, that the little seamstress cousin had thrown herself at the Duke of Rothmere to be noticed, that she had likely torn her own hem on purpose to draw his eye. Lady Winslow said nothing on the ride home, which Eleanor had learned was worse than a scolding, because silence meant her aunt was deciding what to do about it. It was Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, who found Eleanor mending the hem again past midnight and told her, in a low voice, that the Duke did not touch strangers, not since his sister died, and that whatever had happened in that receiving line, it was not nothing. Eleanor did not know what to do with that information, except thread her needle and wonder, for the first time in years, whether her life might yet contain a version of herself worth someone's notice. At the Ashcombe garden party a week later, a matron Eleanor did not know remarked, just loudly enough to be heard, that it was remarkable what some families would allow to walk about in public in a dress fit for a lady's maid. Eleanor kept her eyes on the roses and said nothing, because she had learned that a reply only fed the appetite for more. It was the Duke of Rothmere, standing nearer than she had realized, who answered instead, in a voice pitched low but perfectly clear, that he had always found a mended hem a better measure of a woman's character than an unmended tongue. The matron flushed and found somewhere else to be. Eleanor turned to thank him and found he had already walked on, as though the remark had cost him nothing at all, though she noticed, before he disappeared into the crowd, that his hands were clenched at his sides in a way that suggested it had cost him something after all. Eleanor noticed, too, that he had not smiled once during the exchange, as though defending her were simply a fact to be stated rather than a kindness to be rewarded with charm, and that particular austerity struck her as more honest than any flattery a lesser man might have offered instead. The set was already forming when Eleanor's assigned partner, a young baronet pressed into the arrangement by his mother, developed a sudden and unconvincing headache upon learning her name. Lady Ashcombe, mortified at the prospect of an empty place in her own ballroom, was still stammering an apology when the Duke of Rothmere stepped forward and offered his hand as though it were the most ordinary request in the world. Eleanor felt every eye in the room fix upon them as she placed her fingers in his, aware of the mended seam at her hem with a sharpness she had not felt since the tear first appeared. He danced correctly, formally, without a single unnecessary word, and yet she understood, somewhere in the turn of the third figure, that a duke known for refusing every invitation to dance in 2 seasons had just chosen, deliberately, to dance with the one woman in the room no one else would touch. Lady Winslow did not raise her voice in the carriage that night, but her words carried a warning sharper than any shout. She reminded Eleanor that a duke's momentary courtesy was not an invitation to forget her place, that men like Rothmere danced with poor relations out of pity and nothing more, and that if Eleanor allowed herself to hope for anything beyond the charity already extended to her under that roof, she would find herself removed to her aunt's cousin in Yorkshire before the month was out, mending other people's linens for a wage instead of her own gown for free. Cassandra added, with the particular cruelty of someone who had noticed a rival where she had never expected one, that Sir Edmund Locke had asked after Eleanor's situation only that week, and that a woman in Eleanor's position ought to be grateful anyone at all was willing to overlook her circumstances. Eleanor said nothing, but she understood, for the first time, that her family did not merely tolerate her poverty. They needed it, to keep her small enough to control. It was the Duke himself who sought her out next, at the Hartley Musicale a few days later, finding her alone in the alcove where she always retreated between performances. He did not make conversation about the weather or the music. He asked, instead, who had taught her to mend a hem so that the stitch could not be seen from 3 feet away, because he had noticed, at the garden party, that the tear from the week before had vanished entirely. Eleanor told him the truth, that her mother had taught her before she died, and that the needle case in her reticule had been her mother's, one of the only two things she owned that no one in Winslow House could take from her. Something shifted in his face at that, some private recognition she could not name, and he said only that he understood better than she might expect what it was to keep the last pieces of someone in small, ordinary objects. He did not explain further, and she was left wondering, for the rest of that night, what exactly a duke could have lost that made a needle case make such sense to him. She wondered too, walking back into the crowded music room a few minutes later, whether a man so careful with his own grief could ever learn to be careless with anyone else's, and found, to her surprise, that she rather hoped to find out. They met again, unplanned, in the library at Rothmere House, during a card party Eleanor had not wanted to attend and could not refuse. She had gone looking for a quiet corner away from the noise, and found him already there, a book unopened on his knee, staring into a fire that had burned low. He did not send her away. He asked instead whether she read, and when she admitted she had read every book Lady Winslow owned twice over because there was little else to do in the evenings after the mending was finished, he rose and pulled down a volume of poetry from a high shelf and pressed it into her hands before she could refuse it. It was the first gift anyone had given her in 3 years that was not, in some way, a rebuke disguised as charity. She did not know, holding it, that he had chosen that particular volume because it had belonged to his sister, and that giving it away was the first time in 2 years he had let go of anything of hers at all. It would be many weeks before Eleanor understood that a duke did not give away his dead sister's belongings lightly, and longer still before she understood what it meant that he had chosen, of all people in London, to give this one to her. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern neither of them named aloud. At every event where both families were present, and there were many, the Duke of Rothmere found some small, ordinary reason to stand near Eleanor Hartwell for a quarter of an hour. Never longer, never so long that society could accuse him of courting a woman with no fortune and a mended hem. He asked after the book. She told him which poems she had marked. He asked, once, whether the tear in her hem had returned, and she admitted that it had, 3 times that month alone, always after Cassandra had found some occasion to be near her on a staircase. He said nothing to that, but the following week, a small parcel arrived at Winslow House, addressed to Eleanor alone, containing nothing but 3 yards of gray-blue thread that matched her gown exactly, with no note attached, as though he understood that a note might have been confiscated, but thread could pass for nothing more than thread. Eleanor kept the thread coiled inside the same small box as the needle case, and found herself touching it some evenings the way another woman might touch a locket, a private reassurance that required no explanation to anyone else in that house. It was Sir Edmund Locke who noticed first, because he had begun, at Lady Winslow's clear encouragement, to call on Eleanor with a persistence she did nothing to invite and could not politely refuse. He remarked over tea one afternoon that he had seen the Duke of Rothmere watching her rather more than propriety strictly allowed, and that a woman with no dowry would be wise not to mistake a great man's passing curiosity for anything that might survive daylight. Eleanor said only that she had not mistaken anything, though the words cost her more than she let show. That evening, Lady Winslow summoned her to the drawing room and told her plainly that if a single word of gossip connected her name to the Duke's before Sir Edmund had secured an understanding with her, she would be on a coach to Yorkshire within the week, her mother's needle case notwithstanding, because a family could survive a poor relation, but not a scandalous one. Eleanor sat with the gown across her knees that night longer than the mending required, turning her aunt's threat over the way she turned the needle, careful not to let either draw blood if she could help it. She did not know what the Duke of Rothmere wanted from her, if he wanted anything beyond the small kindnesses he had shown a woman no one else troubled to notice. But she found, mending the hem by the light of a single candle, that she no longer wished to make herself smaller to avoid Cassandra's cruelty or her aunt's calculations, and that the thread he had sent, unasked, sat in her sewing box like a small, stubborn refusal to disappear. Mrs. Doyle, bringing up her supper tray, found her still stitching past midnight and said only that some women were taught their whole lives to apologize for taking up space, and that it took most of them decades to learn what Eleanor seemed to be learning in a single season. Eleanor did not entirely believe her, not yet, but she found that Mrs. Doyle's words settled somewhere beneath her ribs and stayed there, quietly, long after the housekeeper had taken the tray back down to the kitchens. At the Pemberton ball in early June, the Duke of Rothmere did what he had not done in 2 full seasons of determined solitude. He asked Eleanor Hartwell for a second dance in a single evening, a request so far outside ordinary courtesy that the musicians themselves seemed to hesitate before beginning the next set. A second dance, everyone in that room understood, was not courtesy. It was a declaration, or as near to one as a duke could make in a crowded ballroom without actually speaking the words. Eleanor felt the whole room's attention shift toward them like a held breath, saw her aunt's face go the particular shade of white that meant fury deferred rather than fury spent, and understood, taking his hand a second time that night, that whatever quiet arrangement had existed between them until now was over. Everyone had seen, there would be no pretending after tonight, that the Duke of Rothmere had not chosen her, though Eleanor did not yet know whether that was the best thing that had happened to her all season, or the beginning of losing everything she had left. The morning after the Pemberton ball, Lady Winslow did not wait for privacy to deliver her fury. She told Eleanor, in front of both cousins at the breakfast table, that she had humiliated the family by allowing a duke to single her out twice in one evening, as though she were some designing creature angling for a match far above her station, and that whatever Eleanor imagined was happening between them, a man like Rothmere did not marry poor relations. He amused himself with them until the amusement grew tiresome. That afternoon, Eleanor found her gown laid across her bed with the hem torn nearly to the knee, a tear too large and too deliberate to have been an accident of any staircase, and understood without being told that the message was meant exactly as cruelly as it looked. Mend this if you can, and see how far mending gets you now. It took Eleanor 3 nights to repair the tear properly, working in sections so the mend would hold under the weight of dancing rather than tearing again at the first turn of a waltz, and by the time she finished, her fingertips were raw and the candle had burned to a stub twice over. She did not tell the Duke, when she saw him next at the Ashworth Assembly, why she had grown quieter, why she let 3 minutes pass in his company without offering a single word about books or thread. She could not tell him that her aunt had threatened Yorkshire again, more specifically this time, with a date attached, without also admitting how precarious her place in the world truly was, and pride, the same pride that had kept her mending in silence for 3 years, would not yet let her say it aloud, not even to him. The Duke of Rothmere misread her silence exactly as she feared he might, and by the time Sir Edmund Locke made a show of escorting her into supper that same evening, purely at Lady Winslow's engineering, the Duke had already withdrawn to the far side of the room with the particular stillness of a man closing a door he had only just allowed to open. He did not approach her again that night. It was his aunt, the dowager who kept his house, who later told Eleanor the truth she had not known, that the Duke's younger sister, Lady Mary Ann, had loved a man far beneath her, had been mocked for it in rooms exactly like this one, and had died of a fever within a year of a broken engagement that society had forced upon her family, a fever the physicians called influenza, and the Duke, privately, still called a broken heart he had failed to prevent. He did not withdraw from Eleanor because he doubted her. He withdrew because he was terrified of watching it happen twice. Eleanor sat with the dowager's account long after the older woman had gone, turning it over the way she turned every other secret in that house, and understood, for the first time, that the coldness the whole of London attributed to him was not coldness at all, but grief that had never been given anywhere safe to go. Armed with the truth of Lady Mary Ann, Eleanor resolved to find some way to tell the Duke that Sir Edmund Locke was her aunt's design and not her own wish, that she had grown quiet from fear of Yorkshire and not from any change of heart. But before she could arrange even a moment alone with him, word reached Winslow House that the Duke of Rothmere had left London for Rothmere Hall, called away, some said, by business on the estate, though the dowager's face when she mentioned it suggested something closer to a man putting distance between himself and a wound he was not yet ready to risk again. 3 weeks remained before the season's final and most important ball, the one hosted each year by the Rothmere family itself, and Eleanor did not know whether he would return in time, or whether by then her aunt would have already forced Sir Edmund's suit past the point of any graceful refusal. With the Duke gone from London, Lady Winslow pressed her advantage without shame. She informed Eleanor over supper that Sir Edmund Locke had made his intentions plain in a private conversation that very afternoon, that he was prepared to settle a sum sufficient to clear the debts left by Eleanor's late father, debts Lady Winslow had been quietly servicing for 3 years and had no further patience to carry, and that Eleanor's gratitude, if she possessed any at all, ought to take the form of accepting him before the season ended. It was the first time anyone in that house had spoken plainly of the arrangement beneath all the cruelty of the last 3 years. that Eleanor's presence had always been a ledger entry to Lady Winslow, tolerated only as long as it might eventually be converted into something that settled accounts rather than merely consumed them. Eleanor did not refuse Sir Edmund outright, because an outright refusal would have brought consequences she was not yet prepared to survive, but she did not accept him either, and the uncertainty stretched over the following days like a held breath no one in the house would let her release. Cassandra took obvious pleasure in reminding her, at every opportunity, that a duke who truly wanted a woman did not disappear to the countryside for 3 weeks and leave her to fend off other offers alone, that whatever Eleanor had imagined in the library and on the dance floor had likely been nothing more than a lonely man's passing diversion, already forgotten among the business of his own estate. Mrs. Doyle, who alone in that house seemed to wish Eleanor well without calculating what she might gain from it, told her only to trust the thread in her sewing box more than she trusted her cousin's opinion of a man's heart, because the thread, at least, had arrived without being asked to arrive. She did not know, some nights, whether her own resolve came from hope or simple stubbornness, but she had long since stopped requiring the distinction before allowing herself to keep going. At Rothmere Hall, 30 miles from London and further still, some days, from his own better judgment, the Duke received a letter from his aunt that undid 3 weeks of careful distance in the space of 2 sentences. She wrote that Sir Edmund Locke's suit toward Miss Hartwell was very nearly settled, that Lady Winslow had all but promised an answer before the Rothmere ball, and that if the Duke intended to do anything at all beyond regretting the matter privately for the rest of his life, he had perhaps a fortnight to do it. He read the letter twice, standing in the same library where he had once given away his sister's book of poetry without quite admitting to himself why, and understood that the caution which had kept him safe from grief for 2 years was about to cost him something he had not allowed himself to name until that exact moment. Before he ordered the carriage readied for London, the Duke walked to the small churchyard at the edge of the Rothmere estate, where his sister was buried beneath a stone he had chosen himself, plain and unadorned because Marianne had always hated ornament for its own sake, and told her, in the particular silence a man keeps for the dead, that he did not intend to let fear of society's cruelty cost him a second time what it had already cost him once. He did not know, standing there, precisely what he meant to do about Eleanor Hartwell, whether an offer of marriage to a woman with no dowry and a family determined to sell her elsewhere would survive the scrutiny of every drawing room in London. He knew only that he intended to be in that city within 2 days, and that whatever cruelty awaited them both at the Rothmere ball, he did not intend to watch it from a safe distance again. The Duke of Rothmere called at Winslow House 2 days after returning to London, a visit so unannounced and so far outside ordinary calling hours that Lady Winslow received him in the good parlor with her composure visibly assembled at speed. He did not make small conversation. He asked, plainly, whether it was true that Miss Hartwell's hand had been promised to Sir Edmund Locke, and when Lady Winslow began an answer designed to suggest more certainty than actually existed, he asked, just as plainly, to speak with Eleanor herself, alone, for a quarter of an hour, a request no one in that house had the standing to refuse a duke. Eleanor came down to find him standing exactly where he had stood the day he gave her the book of poetry, and understood, before he said a single word, that whatever distance 3 weeks and a false rumor had built between them was about to be addressed directly, for the first time, without pride or silence standing in the way. He told her about Marianne himself, in that quarter of an hour, in fewer words than his aunt had used, but with a weight Eleanor felt in her own chest as he spoke, how his sister had loved a man of no fortune and no title, how the family and society between them had made the match impossible, and how Marianne had died within the year of a fever that everyone politely declined to connect to a broken engagement, though the Duke had never believed the two were unrelated. He told her that when he saw her withdraw after the Pemberton ball, he had assumed the worst not because he doubted her character, but because he had watched hope destroy someone he loved once already, and could not bear, even for a moment, the thought of watching it happen again. Eleanor told him, in turn, about Yorkshire, about the debts, about Sir Edmund's settlement offer, and for the first time since her parents died, she said all of it aloud to someone without softening a single detail to make it easier to hear. He told her, before he left that afternoon, that he had already instructed his solicitor to settle the debt Lady Winslow held over her, not as a condition of anything Eleanor might choose to do afterward, but because no woman should have to weigh her own heart against her family's ledger, and because he had the means to remove that particular weight and no good reason left not to. Eleanor tried to refuse, out of the same pride that had kept her mending in silence for years, until he showed her something she had not expected: a small, neat mend in the cuff of his own shirt, stitches slightly uneven but sturdy, and told her his mother had taught him to sew as a boy. Before, his father's title and fortune made such skills unnecessary for a future duke, and that he had never stopped doing it himself in private, because some habits outlast the need for them and become, instead, a way of remembering who taught you. It was, Eleanor realized, the same reason she still carried her mother's needle case everywhere she went. Eleanor thought, watching him fold his own sleeve back down over the mended cuff, that she had spent 3 years believing competence born of necessity was something to hide, and that he had just shown her, without meaning to make a lesson of it, that it might instead be something to keep. Within the week, the debt was quietly settled. Sir Edmund Locke withdrew his suit with as much dignity as a man could manage under the circumstances, and Lady Winslow, stripped of the one lever she had held over Eleanor for 3 years, retreated into a cold civility that was, in its own way, more dangerous than her open cruelty had ever been. Cassandra and Delphine, watching their mother's authority erode and a duke's unmistakable regard settle on the cousin they had spent years humiliating, did not accept defeat quietly. Eleanor overheard them one evening through a half-closed door, discussing the Rothmere ball less than a fortnight away, and the single gown Eleanor still owned, and what might be done, one final time, to make certain that whatever happened in that ballroom, Eleanor Hartwell would not be standing in it wearing anything a duke could call lovely in front of the entire season. The Rothmere ball was, by long tradition, the last great event of the season, and the one every family in London angled all year to attend, hosted at Rothmere House itself, rather than any rented hall, with the Duke as host, standing at the top of his own staircase to receive his guests. It was widely understood, though never said aloud, that whatever attention a duke paid to a particular guest at his own ball meant a great deal more than the same attention paid anywhere else, because a man did not invite scrutiny of his private preferences onto his own staircase by accident. Eleanor spent the week before it in a state she did not have a name for, equal parts hope and dread, mending the single gown one final time with a care that felt less like necessity now and more like devotion, as though the stitches themselves might carry some of what she could not yet say aloud to him. She did not yet know that he was spending that same week composing and discarding a dozen versions of what he intended to say to her, each one sounding, to his own ear, either too formal or too much like a confession he was not yet certain he had the right to make. 2 days before the ball, a note arrived for Eleanor alone, sealed with the Rothmere crest, and written in a hand she had not seen before but somehow already recognized as his, brief and formal on its surface, and, underneath the formality, unmistakably warm. He wrote only that he hoped she would save him the first dance and, if she would permit the presumption, every dance after it that propriety could reasonably allow, and that he had a great deal he intended to say to her at Rothmere House that he had not yet found the courage to say anywhere else. Eleanor read the note perhaps a dozen times before she allowed herself to fold it away in the same small box where she kept her mother's needle case. 2 objects now instead of one, both of them proof that someone, somewhere, thought she was worth keeping. The night before the Rothmere ball, Eleanor found her gown exactly where she had left it, hanging in the small wardrobe in her attic room, except that someone had taken a pair of shears to the bodice and both sleeves, not the hem this time, not a tier that could be turned, or a seam that could be reset, but long deliberate cuts through fabric that could not be salvaged by any needle, however skilled. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she could make herself move closer, and found, pinned to the ruined fabric with a single pin, a note in Cassandra's unmistakable hand that said only that some things could not be mended no matter how many nights Eleanor spent trying, and that perhaps it was time she learned that lesson properly before she embarrassed the family in front of a duke one final time. She thought, absurdly, of every hour she had spent by candlelight teaching that gown to survive one more evening, and understood that whoever had done this had not merely damaged fabric, but had meant to take something from her that could not be so easily replaced by any needle. Mrs. Doyle found her sitting on the floor of the attic room an hour later, the ruined gown still across her lap, and offered what comfort she had, which was not much, because there was no second gown in that house that could be altered to fit Eleanor's frame in the hours remaining before the carriages departed, and no money of Eleanor's own to buy fabric, even if a modiste could have worked such a miracle overnight. Mrs. Doyle asked, gently, whether Eleanor meant to send word to Rothmere House explaining her absence, and Eleanor sat with the question longer than either of them expected, before she answered that she did not yet know, that some part of her still refused to accept that Cassandra's shears should be the thing that decided whether she ever saw the Duke of Rothmere again, even if she had no earthly notion, yet, of what she meant to wear if she went. Eleanor did not sleep that night, but she did not spend the hours weeping either. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, she remembered the second trunk from her old life, the one Lady Winslow had allowed her to keep in the attic because its contents were judged worthless, and found, folded at the bottom beneath a shawl, one of her mother's old gowns, a soft gray wool from before her mother's marriage, unfashionable by a decade, and plain beyond anything society would call current, but whole, unspoiled, and entirely her own. With Mrs. Doyle's help and 3 hours of careful work by candlelight, they let out the seams enough to fit, added a strip of the gray-blue ribbon Eleanor had saved from the ruined gown's trim, and by dawn Eleanor had something to wear to Rothmere House that no one had cut, no one had lent her out of obligation, and no one could take away from her a second time. Mrs. Doyle, pinning the last fold into place as the sky outside began to lighten, told her that her mother would have been proud of the dress, and prouder still of the woman wearing it, and Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in days, to believe that might be true. Rothmere House at the height of the season's final ball was lit end to end with candles, every window blazing gold against the dark, and Eleanor climbed the staircase in a decade-old gown of soft gray wool that belonged to no fashion plate any of the assembled guests would recognize, aware of every eye that flicked toward her, and away again with the particular cruelty of people deciding, silently, exactly how much to say about it later. Cassandra and Delphine, resplendent in new silk that had cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe across 3 seasons combined, made certain to pass close enough for their whispers to carry, remarking to anyone within earshot that their cousin appeared to have raided her grandmother's trunk, rather than accept that some women simply were not made for a duke's ballroom. Eleanor kept climbing, her mother's needle case tucked into a small reticule at her wrist, and did not once look down at the gown to check whether it still held together, because she already knew that it would. Inside, the ballroom was more crowded and more brilliant than any Eleanor had attended that season. Every notable family in London gathered beneath the Rothmere chandeliers, and she understood within minutes of entering that her gray wool gown had already become the evening's most discussed novelty, murmured about behind fans and glasses of ratafia, with an appetite that made the earlier cruelties of the season feel almost gentle by comparison. The Duke himself was occupied at the top of the staircase, receiving a seemingly endless line of guests with the formal correctness his position required, and though Eleanor watched for some sign that he had noticed her arrival, he was too far away and too besieged by obligation to look up. She found a place near the same pillars that had sheltered her at the very first ball of the season, and thought, with a bitterness she rarely allowed herself, that perhaps nothing had truly changed after all, that she had simply traded one kind of invisibility for a more expensive kind of scorn. It was nearly 3/4 of an hour before the Duke of Rothmere finished greeting his final guest and turned to survey his own ballroom properly, and Eleanor watched the exact moment he found her among the crowd near the pillars, watched his expression shift from the polished neutrality of a host into something far more unguarded, something the whole room would later swear they had never seen on his face before. He did not send a footman to fetch her, and he did not wait for propriety to arrange some acceptable pretext. He simply began walking, directly and without hesitation, the entire length of his own crowded ballroom, past dukes and countesses, and every family that had spent the season deciding Eleanor Hartwell was beneath their notice, and the room, sensing something it could not yet name, began to fall quiet around him as he went. Lady Winslow, watching from near the refreshment table, understood before anyone else in the room exactly what was happening, and found, for the first time in 3 years, that she had no ready words with which to stop it. He reached her with the whole ballroom watching, and stopped close enough that she could see he had not, in fact, planned a single word of what he was about to do, that whatever composure had carried him across that floor was already spending itself in the effort of standing in front of her at all. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear it at first, that he had promised her the first dance and every dance after it that propriety allowed, and that he had decided, somewhere in the last 3/4 of an hour, that he no longer cared to limit himself to what propriety allowed. Eleanor felt her own pulse in her throat and did not trust her voice enough to answer him, and it did not matter, because he was already turning, deliberately, to face the room rather than her, drawing every remaining eye in Rothmere House toward the two of them standing together beneath the great chandelier. He raised his voice only slightly, but a room already half silent carries a voice a very long way, and he said that he understood his guests had spent a considerable portion of the evening discussing Miss Hartwell's gown, its age, its plainness, its evident failure to meet the standard the assembled company clearly expected of a woman worth admiring, and that he had listened to a great deal of that commentary while greeting them individually at his own staircase without correcting a single word of it, because he had wanted, he admitted, to see exactly how far the cruelty would travel before someone stopped it. Lady Winslow's face, near the refreshment table, had gone the color of the tablecloth. Cassandra and Delphine stood frozen mid-whisper, their fans lowered, as the Duke of Rothmere continued speaking into a silence so complete that the musicians in the gallery had stopped playing without being asked. Somewhere near the back of the room, a young footman who had been quietly refilling glasses all evening stopped entirely, glass in hand, unwilling to miss whatever was about to be said in a house that rarely produced any spectacle its own master had not carefully rehearsed in advance. He told them that he had watched Miss Hartwell mend the same torn hem of the same single gown at every ball of the season, night after night, by candlelight, with a needle that had belonged to her dead mother, because her own family had decided one dress was more than a poor relation deserved, and that he had watched her do it without once complaining, without once asking anyone in this room for the pity they would have refused her anyway. He told them that the gown she wore tonight, plain gray wool a decade out of fashion, had also belonged to her mother, taken up in a single desperate night after someone in her own family took shears to the only other dress she owned, and that she had walked into his ballroom wearing it with her head high rather than stay home in shame, though shame, he said, had never once belonged to her in the first place. Loveliness bought new each season from a modiste account, he said, faded by the following morning. Hers had been earned every single night, alone, by a woman too proud to ask for help she was never going to receive, and if the true measure of a woman was what she became when no one was rewarding her for it, then there was no one lovelier in this room, and he intended to say so before every family gathered beneath his roof tonight, whether or not it was the sort of thing a duke was meant to say aloud. He said it plainly, without softening it into a compliment easily forgotten by morning, because he intended every person in that room to carry the truth of it home with them, whether they welcomed it or not. For a long moment, no one in Rothmere House said anything at all, and Eleanor stood beside him with her mother's needle case pressed against her palm inside her reticule, unable to look at anyone but him, aware distantly that somewhere behind her Lady Winslow had gone entirely still, and that Cassandra's face had drained of every ounce of the satisfaction it had worn an hour earlier. It was an elderly countess near the front, a woman known across 3 seasons for saying exactly what she thought regardless of consequence, who broke the silence first, remarking to her companion in a voice deliberately pitched to carry that she had never in 40 years of attending balls heard a truer thing said in one, and that the Winslow family ought to be deeply ashamed of themselves for the whole of London to have learned it from a duke instead of from decency. A ripple of agreement moved through the room, quiet at first and then less quiet, and Eleanor understood, standing there, that whatever the Winslows had spent the season trying to bury her under, it had just been undone in front of every witness who mattered. Even Sir Edmund Locke, watching from near the doorway with an expression somewhere between relief and regret, found himself nodding slowly in agreement, as though some part of him had known all along which of his rivals for her attention had actually deserved to win. The Duke turned back to her then, as though the rest of the room had already served its purpose and no longer required his attention, and asked, in a voice gentler than the one he had used to address his guests, whether she would still do him the honor of that first dance, because he found, having said everything he had come to say, that he wanted very much simply to dance with her the way any ordinary man might want to dance with a woman he admired, without an audience, without a speech, without anything left to prove to anyone in that room. Eleanor placed her hand in his, aware that her fingers were not quite steady, and said that she would, and as the musicians in the gallery found their places again and began, uncertainly at first, the opening bars of a waltz, she understood that whatever came next, in that ballroom or beyond it, would not be decided by her aunt's ledgers or her cousin's cruelty ever again. 3 days after the Rothmere ball, the Duke called at Winslow House for the second time that season, though this visit unfolded with none of the tension of the first. He asked Lady Winslow's permission, as custom required even though Eleanor had long since passed the age where anyone's permission but her own truly mattered, to pay his addresses to her niece properly, and Lady Winslow, whose social standing had not survived the Rothmere ball nearly as well as her ledgers once had, granted it with a graciousness that fooled no one, least of all Eleanor, who recognized calculation even when it wore the shape of surrender. Cassandra and Delphine, for their part, discovered in the weeks that followed that a family associated with public cruelty toward a woman a duke had publicly championed found its invitations considerably thinner than the season before, a consequence neither of them had anticipated, and both of them, in their own way, would spend a long time learning to live with. Mrs. Doyle, informed of the news below stairs, wept openly in the kitchen and told anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very night she found Eleanor mending by candlelight and mentioned the Duke's aversion to touching strangers, that something larger than either of them had already begun. He asked her properly a week later, in the same library at Rothmere House where he had once given her his sister's book of poetry, not in front of any audience and not with any argument prepared, only the plain truth that he had spent 2 years believing he could not survive loving someone society might try to destroy, and that Eleanor Hartwell had taught him, one mended hem at a time, that some people were stronger than whatever cruelty a ballroom could produce. He gave her, along with his ring, a small silver needle case to match her mother's, engraved not with her initials but with both of theirs together, and told her that he did not intend for her to need it out of necessity ever again, only that he hoped she might keep it anyway, the way he still kept his own private habit of mending, because some things were worth continuing long after the need for them had passed. They married before the autumn leaves turned at Rothmere Hall, a quiet ceremony by Eleanor's own request, though half of London contrived some reason to attend regardless, eager now to be seen as having always admired the woman they had spent a full season mocking. Eleanor wore, at the Duke's quiet insistence, a new gown made specifically for the occasion by the finest modiste in London, though she kept, folded carefully in the bottom of her own trunk afterward, both the grey wool gown that had once belonged to her mother and the ruined muslin with its many mended hems, unable to part with either one. As mistress of Rothmere Hall, she found herself, within the year, quietly arranging small kindnesses for other women in situations like the one she had left behind, poor relations and companions, and daughters of diminished fortune, offering them what she herself had wanted most during those difficult years, not charity, but simply to be seen. Mrs. Doyle came to live at Rothmere Hall within the year, at Eleanor's insistence, no longer a housekeeper but something closer to family, the one person from Winslow House whose kindness Eleanor had never once had reason to doubt. On quiet evenings at Rothmere Hall, long after the season's cruelties had faded into the sort of story people told at dinner, rather than the sort anyone still lived through, the Duke and Duchess of Rothmere could often be found together in the library by firelight, exactly where it had all first turned toward tenderness, Eleanor with her mother's needle case open on her knee, mending some small thing that scarcely needed mending anymore, and Julian beside her doing the same to a shirt cuff out of a habit neither of them had ever seen good reason to abandon. Visitors sometimes remarked, seeing the pair of them stitching quietly by the fire like any ordinary couple with nothing grander to occupy an evening, that it seemed an odd pastime for a duke and duchess. Eleanor always answered, when anyone was foolish enough to ask, that she had learned the hard way what a person did with the years no one was watching, and that she saw no reason to stop now that, finally, someone was.